Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another stream. I'm super excited to announce that I'm going to be bringing on some guests onto my live stream. So about a couple weeks ago, I put out a thread on Twitter, and I asked y'all, hey, if I was going to bring guests on my live stream, who would you like to see? And thank you so much to everyone who responded. There was a ton of really great responses. I was able to reach out to a few people, and I'm really thrilled to be able to bring on 15 people in the next couple months. And to kick things off today, I'm super excited to bring on Nader Dabit, who is a senior developer advocate at AWS. I've been following Nader's work for a while in the full stack serverless GraphQL Next.js space, and he does a really amazing job of connecting with the community, putting out high quality content. And I'm really thrilled to talk with him today and to learn more about what he's working on. So everyone in the chat, please give a warm round of applause and a welcome to Nader. And welcome.
Hello. What's up, Lee? Thank you for having me. And thanks for the intro.
Yeah, no problem. Super excited to chat today. Having a great day so far, and this is going to be even better. So how's your day going?
It's doing fantastic. I've been, having a pretty busy day. I had lunch with my wife, drinking my second cup of coffee. So it's kind of a good day so far.
I know I got my coffee ready. I'm like, I need to get that caffeine before I get my meetings going. And yeah, feels like a busy day too.
Yeah, me and you are both in the central time zone, which is kind of rare, I think, for a lot of people in tech. Everyone I talk to is either on the East Coast or the West Coast. So
I know it's funny because we had connected a little bit, and I was like, man, other people in the Midwest is such a blessing to get to talk with people on my time zone. Because when you're working with distributed companies, it's like you got some people in Europe, some people in Asia. It's like you get on some really strange hours calls.
Yes.
Nice. Awesome. Well, there's so much that we could talk about. I think maybe the first thing I want to dive into is just tell me a little bit more about what you're working on right now at AWS and what you're really excited about, because I know there's a lot.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that I'm excited about, and I can kind of talk to a little bit of those and how maybe they're relating to some of the work that I do, because I'm fortunate enough to get to work on the stuff that I'm excited about, which is really fun. And I know you're kind of in a similar situation. And it kind of shows in your work, when you really like something, a lot of times it's a great thing, and it doesn't always happen. I mean, I've been in jobs and careers and stuff, even in coding, where I wasn't really happy with where I'm at. So I'm very fortunate. But right now, my team is the AWS front-end web and mobile team. So when you kind of think of AWS, I think a lot of people think of back-end, and they think of infrastructure, and they think of DevOps and all of this stuff, databases. Well, our team is kind of a little different, and we are kind of, I think, the only team really within AWS that is completely focused on front-end and full-stack development. So my team, we have a few different services and libraries and things that we work on, but it's all kind of encompassed in the front-end web and mobile space. So we do front-end and JavaScript libraries and client SDKs, but we also have mobile SDKs. And over the last couple of years, we've also been building out tooling for cloud services for making the barrier to entry lower for developers to kind of get up and running with cloud computing. And really, it's kind of geared towards traditionally web and front end and mobile developers that are kind of comfortable with a certain set of tooling. They're comfortable in their CLI. They're maybe comfortable in a GUI that kind of allows them to model their data and things like that, as opposed to someone that's a DevOps person that might be used to infrastructure as code, or they might be used to the behemoth AWS dashboard and knowing how all that stuff goes together, which is super confusing, especially as a new developer. So I think that's kind of like our focus is really around building an improved developer experience around AWS, geared towards full stack and front end and mobile developers. And we kind of combine a bunch of things, into like one thing that allow you to kind of use this one thing, but do a lot of other things. So Amplify is the thing that you hear me talk a lot about. Also AppSync, which is a managed API service that happens to be implemented in GraphQL. You could think of AppSync as something like API Gateway, if you've ever heard of that. It's essentially a managed API service. And with AppSync, you can essentially create a GraphQL schema and then map all of your GraphQL operations into AWS. So if you want to build something like what I've been playing around with lately, something like Clubhouse, which you can do using Amazon Chime, which is kind of a managed meeting service. You can map your GraphQL operations into Lambda, and then you just set your permissions in Lambda. You can talk to DynamoDB or databases. You can talk to storage engines, things like Amazon S3. You can talk to all these managed machine learning services. So really, a lot of the power lies within Lambda, within the serverless functions and stuff like that. Very similar maybe to some of the stuff that you're working on at Versailles.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was interesting you talked about just like your first experiences with AWS when you get and you see the console and you're like, there's so many things I can do here. How do I understand the more opinionated choices? And I know that when I first used AWS, I was trying to make sense of all these different services that were out there. And then it took me a while to understand kind of how the pieces went together. And then when I saw Amplify, one of the things I think that's really interesting that y'all are doing is helping provide a little bit more opinionation of those choices and giving you the, good defaults, good developer experience. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't y'all also doing like a admin UI for Amplify too, where you can like have basically like a GUI on top of everything?
Yeah, there's an admin UI. It was kind of released during reInvent a couple of months ago, and it launched with a few different services supported, so data and authentication. And then in the future, we want to add other stuff like being able to add functions and being able to add Amazon S3 and storage and stuff like that.
Nice. That's awesome. So something I'm kind of curious about is like, obviously y'all are doing an excellent job with like the developer experience and the UI and making those pieces of AWS more approachable. And I'm not sure if you know this, but like, how does AWS as a whole decide like where they place their bets? Like, let's place our bets on improving the developer experience of Amplify versus like, let's just make Amplify all of it. Like, let's make that level of DX and UI like as much of AWS as we can. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Like I'm wondering like, why don't they kind of take the things that are working in one area and apply them across the entire company? But AWS is very big now and it's very spread out and it's kind of hard to do that. So you end up seeing a lot of times, to be quite honest, things that do a similar thing that are maybe you could even categorize as competing with each other within the company. So, I mean, there's never anything that's like straightforwardly like doing the exact same thing, but you could kind of accomplish the same thing in a bunch of different ways. And therefore, it becomes even more confusing to someone coming in that doesn't understand all of the implementation details and all of the nuance between all these different things. So the way that they place their bets, and this is really interesting because I've been here now a little over 3 years, so I've gotten to see how this works. And our team was recently in a meeting with people like Jeff Bezos and Andy Jassy, who's now going to be the new CEO. And this is kind of the first time we've been in these types of meetings, but it's because we've gained the momentum and we've gained the growing user base and the revenue that would be necessary to kind of get the attention of someone like that. So from what I can tell, the way that they place their bets is they're very, very interested in customer feedback and developer feedback. So we have been able to gather a lot of feedback since a lot of our stuff is open source. So that's a lot of the stuff, by the way, is just tooling that allows you to build these things without actually, creating a separate service. So like for the Amplify CLI, you're just generating AWS services. So there's not any new service, but because it's open source, we're gathering a ton of feedback and we're able to kind of channel that and prioritize that and then deliver that and then implement new features and stuff based on that feedback and provide well-written documents that kind of go up the chain and that get reviewed by people. So we've recently gained a little bit of momentum within that top level of the company, which is interesting. And I think the way that they choose like where to place their bets is like a combination of existing momentum, innovation, and customer feedback. So you can probably get funding to build a new service within AWS just by hitting one of those on the head. So if you have like a really amazing idea for something, all you have to do at AWS is create a one pager, or it's essentially kind of like a white paper. It's a story kind of describing the thing that you think that should come into fruition and describe like why someone would want to use this and all of the details around that. And if you can get that approved by the right people, you can actually get however X millions of dollars you need to build that thing. But yeah, it's kind of a combination of customer feedback, existing the velocity within your user base, and innovation.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I think too, like seeing Andy go from CEO of AWS to like CEO of Amazon, it's crazy because it just shows like AWS is the future. Like that industry, like the amount of
cloud in general, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think something that's really interesting to me too is your history and your past working with serverless. And I think one thing that I really love is trying to explain complex topics to beginners. And I know this is something that you do all the time, right? So I'd love to hear your like 2-sentence explanation for serverless for people who are like, man, the serverless stuff sounds awesome. And I know that you've wrote like a full book on this, so I'm sure you can go way more in depth, but yeah, maybe like that high level, like why should I care about serverless? Oh, I think maybe I accidentally muted you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I muted myself. I tend to do that because I make a lot of, random noises with my coffee cup and stuff.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to boil this down, I think you could say this. One, no management of server host or server processes. Two, auto scale and auto provisioning of your resources based on the load. Costs are based on the precise usage. So you're not being billed for anything that isn't being used. The performance capabilities are defined in terms of other than the host size or the host count. And then implicit high availability. So you know that these things are going to be available and scalable on demand, and you kind of don't have to worry about that. So kind of combining all of those things together, I think, is what my definition of serverless is. And I think, and I love this topic, and I talk about it all the time because it's, to me, it kind of goes into not only what cloud computing is and what it's going to be in the future, but also all of the amazing companies that are doing crazy, like wild, new and innovative things like what Versailles is doing. It all kind of, a lot of times falls into this paradigm of like quote unquote serverless. But in reality, serverless just became a word, I guess, when managed functions were released, or functions as a service were released. But it's now encompassed this whole industry, and everyone is building things that are managed. And that's kind of like, to me, the real value of serverless is having someone else manage your code for you. And then you just get to use it and take advantage of it. And then have this huge team of specialists that have been building this thing for years and years that kind of have made it really, really good. And you get to just kind of use it. And to me, that's like really interesting when you think about the value there. It's like having engineering teams working on your behalf, and all you have to do is pay them when your actual resources are being used by your customers.
Yeah, that's so true. I always like to think that like in using serverless, it's like I want to abstract away all the things I don't really care about. And I really just want to focus on building my product, because that's actually what matters. I don't want to, I don't want to have to configure my server. I don't want to have to make sure my server's still up. I want Amazon to do that for me. They're the experts at that, right? I think that's really interesting. And it is also cool to hear you talk about, you've been in your role for over 3 years now, obviously learned a lot, grown a lot in that. And it seems like your team is really growing and it sounds like you're hiring now too, right? Like it seems like a lot of room to grow in that space for Amazon too.
Yeah, our team has now just received a little over 40 new available roles to kind of build out a bunch of new things this year. We have two new developer advocate roles open on my team, both for mobile. So if you're watching this and you're a mobile developer, we're really trying to double down on mobile. Our web stuff is doing great, but we have a lot of potential in the mobile area. We just released a Flutter SDK that's going GA, general availability, in the next couple of weeks. Our React Native stuff is there. We have native iOS and native Android, which also went GA a few months ago. And I think we have a huge potential in the mobile space, especially with AppSync. I think that AppSync is just, to me, is, even if I go work at Google, or if I go work at Facebook, or go work at whatever company in the future, I really, really like AppSync. I think AppSync is if it's the one thing I would tell someone to check out, it would be AppSync. And I think it's especially really good for mobile developers because of the benefits that you get of GraphQL. Take all the work that we've done over the last few years to kind of improve it. We've seen it like take off really over the last 12 months or so. And it's just, that's kind of my favorite service, I would say, within the cloud is AppSync. And the reason it's kind of my favorite service is because it kind of encompasses all of the different things that you can do within AWS, all within a single service kind of. So it's like, you have all the benefits of GraphQL, you have all the benefits of cloud, and then you can kind of mash all that together and build really cool stuff really quickly.
Nice. That's amazing. This is like something completely tangentially related to this, but I was watching a couple of your talks, which are really, really great, by the way. And one thing that stood out to me that I personally am terrible about is doing live coding. You do a lot of live coding in your demos. And this is like, it's so crazy to me because it can be the best asset or a complete dumpster fire. Like if you nail it, it's absolutely amazing. And it can also has the potential just to like, oh, I forgot to run like yarn or something, and now my thing doesn't work. Do you have any good stories about like live coding where maybe things went wrong, or just like general tips on for people doing live coding demos?
So I love live coding demos because if you can get them to work, they're very impressive, and they also can take up a lot of the time within your talk. Therefore, you can kind of spend the other time focusing on like a really polished slide deck, and then you can do the live coding. And then there's people out there that really enjoy live coding, and there's people out there that actually learn better from a slide deck. So kind of combining both is, to me, a really cool way to kind of target both people and make sure that everyone has a little bit about the talk that they enjoy. But like for me, I've actually been pretty fortunate in my live coding demos, and I think it's because I end up basically not really doing the live coding myself. What I use is these shortcuts within VSCode where you can type in like a symbol and then it'll just spit out the code snippet. Mm-hmm. So what I do is I build the app from scratch. I save every single chunk of code in the code snippet. And then before the talk that morning, I build out the app a few times and make sure that I kind of have the flow in my head. And then as long as I have network access and my computer hasn't like lost connection to the internet, then it typically works, which is pretty cool. So I would say a lot of people watch my talks and they're like, how did you make that work and get the code snippet? It's just VS Code snippets, the same stuff that probably everyone uses at this point. I just use those in my demos, and I kind of have an application that's already built out. So I'm just kind of rebuilding it, and then I walk through the code, and that seems to be a pretty good approach for me.
That's a really good tip. I hadn't really thought about kind of like saving off the code snippets and then putting them in on the way. Because normally the spot where you screw up is where you like fat finger something accidentally. And so having those saved makes that go like a little bit more seamlessly. That's a good tip. That's nice. One thing I think is really interesting too, in giving a lot of different talks, you obviously have to do a lot of research, not only just to make a good presentation, but also that you understand your subject and related research really well. And I think in doing that, we've both grown to learn a lot about the space with serverless and a lot about the space with the front end and Next.js and GraphQL and all these things. And I think part of what we do a lot, I know that I do this, I know that you do this a lot, is just trying to help people, give them good recommendations on what tools they should use, what's going to help them build their product the best, and also just try to give solid recommendations for anyone from beginners to experts trying to build their stacks. And I'm really curious, like we've talked about this a little bit, but just your approach for trying to educate people on some of these trade-offs, because more now than ever, there's a million different ways that you can build things, a million different tools, libraries, and people are trying to make those like mental model frameworks for how to decide what to use.
Right. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And I think it becomes tougher and tougher the bigger the ecosystem gets, because there's more and more choices and it's more and more fragmented than ever. And then a couple of years from now, it'll be probably even more fragmented because you have, if you pay attention to something like, what is it, the website, not Hacker News, but yes, Hacker News, but also Product Hunt. There's a lot of companies that are building out software as a service, and they all do really cool stuff. Like Auth0 has been around for a long time, but you'll see like a new auth service also come out, and they do their own thing, right, in their own way. So I think the interesting thing that you start learning is like when you're working with some of these things, like how well do they integrate with other things that you need done? And I think keeping in mind all of the things that you need done at the end of your app. So first of all, have that understanding in your head. Okay, I need to do all this stuff, and then go look at the tools and kind of see which ones kind of start fitting into that. And I don't really have like a good one size fits all solution. To me, the great thing about developers is that we're always learning. So I would say go learn and try out all of the things that you see other people having success with. So try out, if you're looking to do cloud stuff, try out Netlify, try out Versailles, try out Firebase, try out, the GraphQL and Hasura. Like there's
Mm.
all these awesome stuff. Like
Yep.
try out all those and kind of get a feel for what they do. And then when you come to the point where you need to build something, you kind of have an understanding about what all these things do. And then you can reach for the best tool for the job. I never tell someone to be married to a technology because it just never works. Because you're gonna like have one situation that it fits great there, but the next time it doesn't. Like someone today was trying to deploy Next.js on AWS, and they were trying to make it work in a certain way. I was like, use Versailles. Versailles like integrates perfectly with Next.js for the use case that you're asking for. So just go that route. And if someone else comes around that has a certain use case, I'm gonna always try to point them to the right direction, regardless of where I work. And I think that's one of the things about being a developer advocate, that if you don't do like your company, if you work for a company that doesn't allow you to be that straightforward and honest and not try to push your stuff on everyone, then you're probably not working for a good company. That's one of the great things that I've enjoyed about my manager. I don't know how it is in all of AWS, but I think it's very similar. Like we're looking to help people become successful. And then during doing that, you get to get customer feedback, get feedback from people and improve the stuff you're doing and try to, make it better. So maybe in the future, when they look for that thing, your thing is good enough. But like, yeah, I mean, the ecosystem is so big though. I don't know. I'm kind of curious what your take is when someone asks like, oh, I want to do this thing. Which tool should I use? I mean, there's so many out there. I guess it kind of, I would really be interested in what you have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved your point about trying to be like as unbiased and honest as possible because, developers are smart and they know if you're selling them snake oil. Like they know the things that suck. They know the things that are good. So when you can be just straight up and honest and say, you know what, for this use case, this works great. But I'm just gonna be honest. Like if you try to do this on this platform, you're not gonna have a good time because they're gonna hit that roadblock eventually. And the more transparent you can be in the beginning, I think the better off you are. Now, obviously you can still shoot for the moon and try to like do as much well as you can, but you have to also be realistic with people who are trying to launch projects, who have deadlines, who just need to get stuff done. So coming back to your question about how I try to educate people on the decisions on what they're making, like a very frequent question I get is like, just like a 2-paragraph dump of, hey, I want to build this with like these 3 technologies. And I'm like, hold on a second. Like, what are we trying to build here? Because it's so contextual about the different technologies you want to use. So getting a little bit of that backstory helps me understand what they're trying to do. And more often than not, I think it falls into something that we talked about a little bit earlier, which is the old world, I guess you can call it, of more monolithic style applications, a la like, let's say 10 years ago, right? And then transitioning into this more decoupled world, headless, serverless, whatever you want to call this, where you have this flourishing like API economy. Everything that you want to do from a connector or a back end system, you can probably find some API for that, whether that's getting from something as high level as like a Zapier, where it's like you can just plug and play with webhooks, or even doing something like scaffolding out GraphQL APIs. Like you can go really far with that stuff. And a lot of people are still changing their mental models for, I have an application, but now I'm equipped. It's a double-edged sword too. I'm equipped with like the ability to pull whatever services I need. And you talked about this earlier, like those services have to pair together really well. It's all about that integration, because if it takes 6 different services to build a modern web app, those services need to work really well together. Otherwise, we should just go back to Rails. Like they have to mesh together very, very well. So I try to provide solutions where hopefully it lets them fall into the pit of success, which is a term we use a lot at Versailles, which is just like helping people do the right thing easily. Like it should be hard for them to screw up. Like not only should it be good, like they should have to actively try to screw something up ideally.
That's awesome. I love that mindset. I mean, I think one of the things that just always blows me away is how good Versailles seems to execute on everything. Like they execute well on design, they execute well on developer experience, they execute well on open source, they execute well on hiring. I mean, they just are hitting it all on all cylinders. I think I'm a big fan.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things I really love about Versailles, I love all of the employees who work here. There's so many incredibly talented people, but from the top down, I think that like 3 pillars that really fundamentally change how we build product. Is we have Guillermo, who's really leading the technical vision, right? And we have Leo, who's leading that product focus. Like, how do we really delight our customers? And the combination of them, Evil Rabbit for design, and then obviously like the whole Next.js team, the combination of all of them working in sync with the rest of the Versailles team to actually execute on these things leads to really good outcomes, in my opinion, because from the top, they are oriented around kind of first principles thinking. And the first principles being, how do we get people in that pit of success? How do we make the best developer experience possible? How do we make, extremely delighted, satisfied customers? If we can do that, then those people end up converting, and that will handle like the sales side of the organization. So if we focus on those fundamental pillars, everything else seems to kind of stream downstream from that to end up with people using the Versailles platform. So I'm definitely I'm very grateful, and also just enjoy working with a lot of the people. Like, a really interesting note was just last week, we did an internal hackathon. So during all of last week, we had, all the engineering teams broke out doing really cool projects. And then we had our presentation, like showing off the projects on Monday. And it was like absolutely mind blowing. Some of the stuff that people could build in a week. Like, I was like, how did you guys do in a week? Like, it would have took me like 4 months to do this. Like, just absolutely insane. So there's a lot of really talented engineers and product design people, salespeople. So yeah, very fortunate.
That's so cool. I mean, I think that's another point in general that we're just kind of moving towards is the developer velocity and the ability to do cool things and build things quickly in a way that you just couldn't have before, and then have them scale. I think that yesterday there was that company that created the pillow or something like that, and they hosted their site on Versailles, and they were like, and then they tweeted out after getting like all these millions of visits or however many visits, they're like, the site's still up. I mean, if you thought about maybe trying to do that in the past, you would have had to have quite a bit of technical expertise, I think, to actually make that happen and be able to handle like these massive spikes in load,
Yeah, it was kind of crazy because I saw that tweet and then I looked and it was like #1 trending on Twitter. There was like an article on Washington Post about this company. I think it was Good Pillow or something about pillows, but
yeah, something about pillows.
Something about pillows, e-commerce pillows. But yeah, to your point, it's funny too, because I've worked on teams in the past that were serverful instead of serverless. And I've hit some of those limitations where, I worked at a regional grocery company in Iowa that had, tons of stores across the Midwest. And when COVID hit, like our online grocery shopping just went through the absolute roof, like unprecedented number of people trying to buy their groceries online. And there were a few periods there where it was like all hands on deck, like, oh my gosh, from like a DevOps perspective, from like a front end engineering perspective, to like, how can we make our site more resilient? I see these errors coming in Sentry, like we got to fix these things. So it is kind of crazy how, if architecting newer applications in this serverless mindset, both from like a front end and a back end engineering way, helps you kind of prevent some of that unexpected scaling where, you don't have to be all hands on deck when your site blows up on a news article or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say also, when you start thinking about some of the different things that are available out there, and the number of people that used to need to build that thing also is going down. So when you think about some of the apps and stuff that are seeing coming out, like Y Combinator, we work pretty closely with Y Combinator at this point, and the teams are shrinking to get a lot more done, because of all of these things that they're able to start using at their disposal. And I think that's just another cool thing about all this, that you can get a lot more done with less people. And this has always drawn my attention, this idea of innovations in software that allow you to do this. And the first one that really I was involved with, that I kind of was able to take advantage of in my career, really was React Native. And really now you're starting to see this really with React, because React, and I tweeted something out after someone created a really interesting video app, or not a video app, like a video framework for creating videos with React.
Yeah.
There's so much stuff you can do with React. So the idea of learning one thing and being able to do a lot with that one thing to me is an extremely valuable skill to have, or just something to keep in mind when you're learning. I think I would say more of a thing than an actual skill, because it's more of like a thing that you want to try to look out for and take advantage of when you see that opportunity. So with React, you learn React, you can create mobile apps, you can create desktop apps, you can create, all these other things we were going over yesterday, like watch apps and, PDFs. Anyway, so you can do all this stuff, right? So I think the serverless stuff is very similar. Like if you understand how to use these tools, you can do a lot without really learning anything else, because as a front-end developer, we're already working with APIs. The only difference now is that we're the ones creating these APIs as opposed to the back-end developers. So we already knew how to do this stuff, but knowing how to kind of maybe a little bit of how to put these things together, then we now have the power, not of a full-fledged, maybe senior level back-end developer, but maybe we have the power of like some of that, the work that that person was able to kind of produce, and we can kind of pair that with our front end, and we can now build out really interesting stuff with just ourselves, maybe one person. And you were saying like people were building out amazing things within a week. Yeah, we're seeing stuff like that. I mean, we're seeing startups that get millions of dollars in funding within a couple of weeks of building something, happening all the time.
Yeah, that's crazy. One thing before I respond to this, I just want to say, feel free to throw questions in the chat, everyone. What we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll make sure that we answer some of your questions in the chat and pull them up on the screen and talk through them. But to your point about React for everything, like I saw your tweet about just all the different things you can build with React. And it is, I think one of the ones that's most mind-blowing for me too is, well, a couple people using them for like AR and VR. That's awesome and crazy. They're like people using them to build like operating systems. It's just like absolutely insane. There's even one where it's called React Nil, I think, where you can basically use the underlying engine of React, but you don't render anything. So it's like, I want this like stateful model. I already understand the component model, the state model. I don't actually need to render anything. Like I'm on the server, or I'm like in a CLI or something, but I still want to use that same mental model that I already know. Like that blows my mind. And then like the last one I think is so cool is React 3 Fiber and like doing WebGL and graphics. I'm going to have somebody on my live stream in a few weeks down to talk a little bit more about this, but it's like absolutely insane the amount of stuff that you can do with this and create these like such immersive online web experiences. I do think like the future of e-commerce too, I think we're going to see a lot more of these type of just completely different immersive e-commerce experiences. Like Kanye had a new drop for Yeezy, and his like e-commerce store was like just something I'd never seen before, like completely out of left field, like just reimagine what that would actually look like. And same with like, there was this like European, I don't remember what type of e-commerce it was, but you could like click on the different interactive pieces of like a 3D model and like build out your shelf or something. Like it's just absolutely nuts.
Yeah. It's pretty exciting. I'm just now starting to kind of go through some of the comments too as well. I did not even have the comment section open until now, so sorry, I got a little bit sidetracked there.
No worries at all. I will. I'll try to go through some of these and pull some out from here. I'll just start at the top. So like, thank you everyone, seriously, who's joining in from all over. We really appreciate having you guys in the chat, leaving comments and joining us today. It's always fun to have people here live asking questions. You know, obviously Midwest represent. We love to see people from the Midwest here. And, you know, I'm glad that y'all are finding Amplify great. I'm sure Nader would love to hear more about that as well too. And the admin UI as well too. Yeah, it's interesting to compare that to like a Firebase or a GCP for sure. One thing I think that would be kind of interesting to talk about, I don't think a lot of people realize that you can get some pretty awesome credits for AWS to, whether you're like trying to be a startup or some sort of initiatives, to get free credits to run on AWS. Like, I don't think people understand some of the free tiers there. Like, could you share more about that? Because even I know the basics.
Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and get this link right here and share it in the chat. So there is a few things I'll talk about. I'm not sure where can I share this.
You should be able to drop it in the chat, and it'll show
Here,
up in the live stream chat.
I'm gonna put it in the private chat because I was unable to add it in the comments.
Oh,
So basically there's two things here, I guess. First is free tier. Well, there's three things. Okay. So one of them is a little veering off of this, but there's the free tier. So when you sign up for AWS, you get a 1 year free tier. And that means that most AWS services are free for 1 year to some level. And most of the time those levels are very much enough for someone that's, building out an MVP or playing around with something, even launching a small product without having to actually pay anything. And then after 1 year, you start paying whatever that service or the services you're using costs. But I would say a lot of the stuff that we're working towards, and the thing that I kind of like to build with, is the serverless technologies, which are pay per compute anyway. So even if you get over that free tier and you're just building something and you don't have a user base, it's going to be either $0 or close to $0 until you start scaling up your users. So if you're building out your app using serverless services, which are pretty much everything that Amplify supports, with the exception of containers and Elasticsearch, then you're pretty much going to be paying nothing until you get users. And then the other thing is there's this program called AWS Activate. Pretty easy to get credits through this program. And if you have like a startup that has gone through something like an accelerator, you can get a lot of money, like up to like $10,000 or $100,000. But if you're just like yourself, like running a bootstrap company, you can actually pretty easily get in the range of like $100 to $1,000 as well. So I see a lot of indie people or just independent entrepreneurs that want to start playing around with AWS but don't want to pay anything at first. If you just want an easy way to get credits, I recommend checking out AWS Activate. And you should, if you have like a basic company name or anything like that you can share, it's pretty easy to get accepted into that and get some credits. You also get a little bit other things, like you get connected with people that you can reach out to and ask questions and stuff. Nice.
I didn't realize that you could get that much. That's crazy for small businesses or like entrepreneurial startups. That's amazing. This question is interesting because I've never really done anything with blockchain. I don't know. Have you done anything with blockchain or have any ideas where we could point somebody in this direction?
No, but there's a really cool technology, and I've bought some of their cryptocurrency called the Graph. And it's basically a way to build crypto apps with GraphQL. And they have kind of like a managed service and also some type of SDK that you can use. So that would be where I would point it. I've never actually built anything with blockchain, so I have no idea.
Yeah, neither have I, but it sounds cool.
But maybe we can do a demo. Like that's a good idea. Maybe this gives us an opportunity to kind of look into that. So,
oh yeah, that would be really fun. That would be cool to learn more about for sure. This is a question that has a +1 Great question. As we both work at Versailles and AWS, can you give examples when you choose one over the other? Yeah, I can start on this one. So a really good mental model for me is if you think about Versailles as kind of like a platform as a service, and AWS is like your infrastructure as a service. So I usually tell people, if speed to shelf is something that you absolutely are trying to optimize for, and you try out the Versailles platform and it works well for you, then absolutely. There are people who need the most fine-grained control over the infrastructure. So if you think about people who maybe have more of a backend or DevOps experience, these people who want to have that control, whether they're building, a medium to large size application, or even people building just hobby things, I tend to steer those people just towards AWS directly or with Amplify or something in that nature, because then they have the full ability to kind of customize whatever they want. Does that kind of track with you as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that, it just kind of depends. To answer this question though, and give you like a real world example, I mean, I've actually seen some of the examples that you've done where you're kind of integrating DynamoDB with Versailles. So you can actually use both. So I kind of think it just depends. If you're going into an app knowing that you're going to need a bunch of AWS services, and that you might not need something like server-side rendering for your Next.js app, I would probably not go with Versailles. If you are looking to have like a first-class hosting experience for Next.js, supporting the APIs that it supports now, as well as the stuff that it's going to support in the future, I would definitely go with Versailles. If you're actually brand new to all this stuff, like if you're a new developer as well, and you want to have like the best experience, go with Versailles as well. Because I would say even with what we're doing and the work we're trying to improve the developer experience for AWS, it's still not where Vercel is. I think that's one of the things that they just really do a great job of, is like just a really, really good user experience and developer experience. Also, you don't need a credit card to sign up with Vercel. You have to have a credit card to sign up with AWS. So if you're a student or you're a young person or you're just someone that doesn't want to give over your credit card, go with Vercel.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, but you can build scalable stuff on Vercel too, because like we were saying, there was that company that kind of built something and millions of people using it at scale. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use it for like these heavy duty projects. I would just say, like, you know, based on some of the stuff I said, take those things into consideration, you know.
Yeah, you brought up a really good point that I completely glossed over, which is like Vercel is going to be the place where you have your front end and your serverless functions. But if you need a database, like there's no database on Vercel. So you could still have your, you know, Postgres database, your GraphQL API or whatever inside of AWS, and then still use Vercel well. So they're not necessarily like mutually exclusive in that regards. There's definitely a lot of people who will stitch together those services, whether they need SQS for a queue or RDS for their database or any number of services there. Yeah. What are good questions we got here?
Someone said, well, yeah, you can go ahead and pull that one up. Yeah.
Okay. I'll let you get the next one. Is it possible to make a great real-time app with serverless? This is one of those ones I feel like the answer is
a good
yes.
question.
It's a great question because it requires that mental model shift of like how you would build real-time in a serverful world versus in a serverless world. So I think a lot of people get stuck on the mindset of a WebSocket when in reality, like there are services that abstract that a little bit for you in the real-time space that make it super easy to integrate with serverless. Trying to remember this one that's like collaborative multiplayer, Room Service, and for like you know, building like a Figma multiplayer type experience. Very, very cool. What are your thoughts on this?
So I just did a Clubhouse a few days ago with David East of Firebase, and David is kind of so he's like, I would say someone that I modeled almost like my career off of. If you kind of like, I remember one of the first conferences I ever went to, and I saw David East, and I remember looking at him like, wow, like this person's doing all this cool stuff, and like I want to be like him one day. And then I have a room with him a few days ago, and we're kind of doing the same thing at this point. So to me, it was like really amazing to kind of like progress, and now we're working in a similar space. But I think Firebase is a great example of real time. So yeah, you can do real time, and there's a bunch of different ways. So Firebase is one example, and I would say Firebase didn't brand themselves as serverless, but that's what they are. They're not using servers. There's also Hasura, which is a really, really great way to build real time apps that are quote unquote serverless. I don't know if that would be fully considered serverless considering the Postgres database type of thing, but I know typically people use that within the serverless stack. And again, things are like, when you say serverless, it's like more or less serverless. It doesn't actually have to mean, it's running in a Lambda function. And then there is Lambda function. So you can actually do this with WebSockets, but it's actually quite hard because you have to kind of set up everything with Lambda and API gateway, and then you start getting a lot of complex stuff happening there. But I think really, and I'm going to go back to AppSync because I mentioned this earlier, we're seeing a massive increase of usage for real-time apps built with AppSync. AppSync is like I mentioned, a real-time GraphQL as a service that has subscriptions built in. And these subscriptions, we've had these subscriptions scale out to tens of millions of connected clients for a single API endpoint. So one of our biggest early customers was Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster would have these tickets that would go on sale. This was pre-pandemic, right? Where they would have like a massive stadium, and they would go from 0 users to like, I don't know, a few million connected users sometimes within a millisecond, because everyone would be signing on trying to buy tickets for a thing. And I remember things were selling out and people were scalping stuff in some instances. But the general idea is they were seeing these massive scale up and scale down use cases. So they needed a way to kind of have the app update in real time with the tickets that were available. So they were one of our earliest customers, and we've been they've been helping us actually scale the service since the early days. And after we got over some of the initial issues that we had with the service at the early days, like we now are able to, like I say, scale out these real-time subscriptions to tens of millions of connected devices for a single API. So if I was going to build an app right now, a real-time app that was serverless, I would use AppSync. It's just really easy to get up and running with. Subscriptions are built in. It's a really nice way to go about it. If you're on GCP, I would use Firebase, or if you're already familiar with Firebase, I would probably go with Firebase. Hasura is a great option as well. Any of those would work. I haven't actually done WebSockets in a Lambda in a real world scenario, so I don't really know how hard it would be to kind of get a lot of the things around authentication, authorization, and fine-grained access control, which are typically the areas that you run into the most problems with here.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have a question that you wanted to pick?
Oh yeah, I did. Let's see here. There was a question, so let me kind of go through here. Oh yeah, so I'm curious, what is Versaille's take on the serverless frameworks Next.js plugin and like that plugin in general? I thought that was a pretty interesting question.
Yeah,
because Eric is actually on my team.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's awesome, the community like effort around making that in a kind of agnostic way for anywhere that can run that serverless infrastructure. I think the serverless framework in general is just really cool. There's a lot of good stuff coming out of that. And I also saw one the other day for the HashiCorp Terraform.
Ooh, I saw that too. Yes, I want to try that.
And I was like, oh, that's really cool, because I think a lot of people are familiar with that as well. So
and with that, you can deploy to like Azure as well, right?
Yeah, you can really, like, that infrastructure as code is really, really cool. I think what's interesting for me too is helping people who, if they can't use Versailles, then giving them a happy path to doing that wherever else they would like to do it. We want to make sure that community is well supported and that we're putting them into the pit of success too. And, in an ideal world, we would have an infinite number of resources to help out all these people. So I definitely really appreciate all the people from the community who help build these things such that it's easy for people to start using Next.js, because it's a lot of work for sure. Nice. What other great questions do we got in here? Versailles is more than roll your own to AWS. The way that I like to pitch Versailles, I guess, like the 1 minute pitch would be, it's really about develop, preview, ship, and then we're now talking more about like the iteration period after that. So it's really the entire collaboration of your development team, from front end to designers to product to any stakeholders. So yes, you have the managed infrastructure for you, but you also have our CDN that takes care of distributing it globally to a bunch of different edges and points of presence. And then you also have like other providers. You have the preview URLs so that you can collaborate and share those. We actually have people who are customers of Versailles who that's all they use, is they just use for the collaboration piece, and they do something different for their production hosting, because that preview deployment is such a fundamental piece of how they collaborate as an organization. So there is more to it than that, but I mean, we could talk more about that at another time. This is interesting. People hesitant about serverless, and what do I think about the next year for serverless services? What do you think?
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting question. I hear similar takes. And I think also one thing that I have to always keep into consideration is, like, when you're in tech and you start meeting other people in tech, a lot of times you stay within a bubble. And I think I am currently within the AWS bubble, and also the front end bubble, and also the serverless bubble. So I start getting involved in this thing, serverless. I start connecting with other people there. Before I know it, everyone in my audience, everyone that I am within their audience as well, that's speaking to me, is talking about building things in serverless. So I start losing a little touch with the people that are kind of still using, EC2 or managing their own servers. And when you start doing that, you stop hearing about the challenges that those people are having. So I think that this kind of question, I don't see it as often now as I may have in the past, but there are challenges for building with serverless. That's absolutely the case. And I think that, again, it's about using the best tool for the job. And the way that I typically see the industry going, and if you look at the Berkeley View on Cloud Computing, the paper that was put out from them in 2019, they did an entire extensive deep dive with a bunch of PhDs investigating and looking at a bunch of research and trends over the last few years within companies and within the cloud computing industry. And their general consensus was that everything is moving serverless. Everything in cloud that can be serverless will be serverless. And serverless computing is actually becoming less and less expensive, to the point that it will be less expensive at some point then server full computing. That being said, while we are moving in that direction, there are certain things that are typically not well suited for serverless. So, for instance, long running tasks are one that you hear often. Now, you can do somewhat long running tasks within a function, but at some point you have to time that out, because the whole idea behind serverless is only using that resource when you need it. So, I mean, there are areas like that where serverless isn't a good choice. Maybe if you're doing really deep machine learning processing, anything where you kind of need this really, really extensive compute processing that maybe takes a long time, that's not a good area. But I think like the way that I see the industry heading in general is kind of like people taking a serverless first approach more and more often. So you kind of look at the thing that you want to build. If it can be done in serverless, it's typically cheaper and faster and things like that to kind of get it done, using serverless, or kind of that's where it's headed at least. And if it cannot be done, and then that's kind of where you would still reach for, rolling your own infrastructure or whatever. That's kind of my take.
Yeah, I echo everything that you said, plus even saying the hardest part, in my opinion, is the re-education or the education piece around the differences between the world that people lived in a serverless world and the world that people live in a serverless world. Because I'm seeing a few other questions in here about handling databases and how to handle persistent connections and like people seconding that. How do I handle
that's a
connections
good
to
question.
something like Postgres? And it's interesting because for a lot of people, it kind of like just worked in Serverful. You didn't really have to think about these, but now that it's a completely different architecture and mental model, you have to handle some of these things different. And part of my job, and I'm sure part of your job as well too, is trying to help people understand these things. So we can talk about this pretty quickly, but basically there's two things to be conscious of for an application with a really large scale, and you're making a lot of different connections to something like a Postgres database, right? One option is to use something called PG Bouncer, which uses connection pooling. So basically, instead of every single function, which is just a stateless function, instead of every single one opening up a connection to your database and very quickly exasperating those connection limits, there's basically a thin layer in between that pools all of those together and then makes single connection to, or less connections to the database so that you don't exasperate those limits. That's one part. And then the other would be understanding that for the lowest latency and the best response times, you want your functions, your serverless functions, to be placed close to your database. So if your database is in US East in AWS, you also want to run your functions in the same region so that you get the best latency. Anything else you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I would probably add. One is that there is the option for a serverless Postgres now, and you can use something called the Data API. And we just at AWS released a version 2 of serverless Postgres that scales up and down really, really quickly within microseconds at a very high scale that you can use without any connection pooling or having to worry about the connection at all, using something called the Data API. I've written a blog post about this on the official AWS blog if you want to check it out. And then the other thing is that of course, if you're using a relational database, you're used to that, you're probably going to stick with that. But what we're seeing with these really highly scalable, types of apps that people are building a lot of times on AWS, customers like Airbnb, BMW, Lyft, Netflix, Nike, Snapchat, these big customers are actually reaching for a NoSQL for DynamoDB. Now, DynamoDB needs, thinking of the way that you model your data, but it's actually a very, very easy way to talk to a database from a serverless function. And I know that you've done some stuff around DynamoDB as well. So that's just another consideration, right? So you might not be interested in DynamoDB, but if you are worried about the limitations of working with Postgres, consider DynamoDB. But also consider what you've mentioned and maybe serverless Postgres, which is there just to solve this problem.
That's really interesting. I hadn't seen or I haven't tried the serverless Postgres offering from AWS. So I'm gonna have to check that out because I know a similar thing in the space that the team at Supabase is doing, which is like an open source Firebase. They're doing, and I'll probably butcher the pronunciation, but it's like post rest. So it's like Postgres over HTTP. And I'm not well versed enough to like educate on the specifics of that, but this also helps relieve that connection issue because you're just going over HTTP. So I wonder if that's kind of similar to the data layer. I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to learn more about that. That's pretty awesome. Yeah, it would be fun to do. I could try to do a live coding. I'll try my best. We could try to do a joint coding session sometime. That would be very
Next,
cool. Oh, this is great because it's like it's one of those questions that I had this exact same question. Like, why would you call it serverless? Because you are correct. There is still a server somewhere running behind the scenes. Really, the difference is that somebody else is managing that for you, right? That's the best way I can explain it.
Yeah, exactly. The way I think I've heard someone compare it to wireless. Like when you're using a wireless phone, it's wireless to me, but it's not actually wireless to get the call from me to the next person. There are wires in there. I just don't have to manage the wires.
Oh wow, that analogy just kind of blew my mind. That's so good. That's such a good analogy. Wow, that's
I thought that
amazing.
was pretty good too. That's why I kind of stole it from someone else.
Yeah. Oh, this is a good one. I've had people ask me this before. So serverless, what's the best way to do caching for something like Redis? What's the is the AWS equivalent of this like Elasticache, running Redis and Elasticache?
Yeah, there are a few different ways that you can do that. That's one approach, and that's probably the most popular approach for what I've seen in the wild. Um, there's also something that we've recently added. If you're using AppSync, we actually enable now caching for you, and you have a lot of fine-grained control around the caching strategy that you would like. You can even cache GraphQL types. You can cache GraphQL queries. You can cache fields within a GraphQL query, I believe. So you kind of have a lot of control over that. And since AppSync is serverless, it's kind of a nice approach built into an existing service. Like it would be almost like if API Gateway had a similar thing.
Nice. Yeah, one other service to check out if you're interested in this is called Lambda Store, which recently rebranded to Upstash. They're like a managed version of this too, which is something pretty cool to check out. You see any good questions you want to answer?
Let's see here.
Let's see.
Cloudflare workers or edge
Yeah,
computing? That's a good question.
that's a great question.
So I actually don't know a ton about Cloudflare workers in the sense that I haven't actually used them a lot and kind of understand, everything about them as a company and as a service. But edge computing in general is a really interesting topic to me, and I'm sure it is for Lee as well, because Versailles has been a huge innovator like in this space around kind of how to take advantage of some of the innovations that are happening in general and kind of make them more available to the everyday person. Because really when you're using something like Versailles, you're taking advantage of over 200 edge locations around the world. So when you kind of upload your files to your site via the Versailles CLI or whatever your deployment is, then that automatically gets distributed to all these edge locations, and then the user is kind of using them or contacting your API, and it gets served from their nearest location. Something I saw recently, though, was something I think it was called fly.io, and they're kind of taking this another step further, where they're essentially providing containers at the edge. So you are able to kind of get the benefits of edge computing, and you're also not limited to some of the stuff that people were talking about around the limitations for serverless if you need things like a Postgres database or something like that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It's fly.io. Seems like a cool service. I haven't tried it yet, but I want to. But I think when you start seeing stuff like that happening, people are starting to recognize the power of edge computing, and people are doing more stuff. I think that's going to be an area that we're going to see a lot of growth in the next couple of years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would echo almost similar things. I think edge computing in general, one thing that's really interesting too to me as we think about kind of the future of Next.js, the future of serverless, is enabling things like personalization at the edge, A/B testing at the edge, feature flags at the edge, making things like this and just building the future of web apps easier at the edge, such that when I get my markup, it comes from the server and I don't have to, spend more of my JavaScript budget on a client-side A/B testing framework, or some way to dynamically switch out what's running through a feature flag, or have to have a suboptimal developer experience and user experience if like the content flashes because it didn't match an A/B test or it didn't match a feature flag. So I think edge computing is really interesting there to see how that will help expedite the adoption of serverless as well too. So I'm pretty pumped to see how that continues to progress. One thing though, I want to make sure that I'm conscious of your time. I know we're running up on an hour, so I think we should wrap this up, I just want to say, first off, thank you so much for joining me and chatting today. This was a blast. Thank you to everyone in the chat who gave so many amazing questions. We tried to get to as many as we could, but there were quite a few. So thank you for sticking around. Feel free to reach out to us on Twitter. If you have any more questions, we'll be happy to answer. And yeah, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Lee, and thanks for all the awesome questions. And if you have any questions for me, you want to hit me up one-on-one, I'm Dabit3 on Twitter. I'll be happy to answer any questions there.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This is going to conclude the stream. Have a great day.